Imagine you're working as a flight attendant, doing your job at 33,000 feet in air, when suddenly everything goes wrong. The plane explodes. You're thrown into the freezing sky, falling toward Earth at terminal velocity with no parachute, no protection, nothing but the clothes on your back. You fall for miles and miles, watching the ground rush up to meet you, knowing that impact means certain death. But then something impossible happens. You survive. Not only do you survive, you wake up in a hospital weeks later and eventually walk again. This isn't fiction, this isn't a movie, this is the true story of Vesna Vulović, a Serbian flight attendant who holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. On January 26, 1972, she fell 33,330 feet, over 6 miles, when her plane was destroyed by a bomb, and against all laws of physics and medicine, she lived to tell the story. How did she survive when everyone else died? What went through her mind during the fall? What was her life like after experiencing the impossible? Today we're diving deep into one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history, a story so incredible that even scientists struggle to explain it. Buckle up, because this journey is going to be unforgettable. Let's set the scene. It's January 26, 1972, in Copenhagen, Denmark. Vesna Vulović is 22 years old, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, working as a flight attendant for JAT Yugoslav Airlines, the national carrier of Yugoslavia. She's only been working as a stewardess for about a year, still relatively new to the job, still excited about traveling across Europe and seeing new places. On this particular day, she wasn't even supposed to be on this flight. Another stewardess named Vesna, also named Vesna, was originally scheduled for JAT Flight 367 from Stockholm to Belgrade, but there was a mix-up with the crew assignments. Our Vesna was called in at the last minute to replace her colleague. She almost said no because she was tired and wanted a day off, but she agreed to take the flight. That decision, that simple yes, would change her life forever and put her in the history books. The flight was routine, a regular scheduled service that JAT had been operating for years. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, a popular twin-engine jet that was considered reliable and safe. Registration number YOHT, it was a relatively new plane, only a few years old, well-maintained, with an experienced crew. The flight path was straightforward. Leave Stockholm, fly south over Denmark and East Germany, cross Czechoslovakia, and land in Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia. Total flight time would be about 2.5 hours. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just another day at the office for the crew. On board were 28 people total, including the crew. Most passengers were Yugoslav citizens returning home from business trips or visiting family in Scandinavia. There were also a few foreign travelers. Everyone settled into their seats as the DC-9 pushed back from the gate in Stockholm. The weather was cold and clear, perfect flying conditions. The engines spooled up, the plane accelerated down the runway, and at 3:15 p.m. local time, Flight 367 lifted off into the winter sky. The climb was smooth, the service began, and Vesna started working her way through the cabin, serving drinks and meals, chatting with passengers, doing what flight attendants do. Everything was completely normal. The passengers read newspapers, some dozed off, business travelers worked on documents, families with children kept the kids entertained. Up in the cockpit, the pilots were in communication with air traffic control, following their flight plan exactly, reporting their position as they crossed from Swedish to Danish airspace and then into East German airspace. The DC-9 climbed to its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet, leveled off, and the seatbelt signs were turned off. Vesna and her fellow crew members moved freely through the cabin. About an hour into the flight, they were over East Germany, specifically over the small town of Hermsdorf in Thuringia, when something went catastrophically wrong. At exactly 4:01 p.m., at 33,330 feet, an explosion tore through the forward baggage compartment of the aircraft. The blast was enormous, so powerful that it ripped the DC-9 into several pieces instantly. There was no warning, no time to react, no time for the pilots to send a distress call. One moment the plane was flying normally, the next moment it was disintegrating in the sky. The explosion was caused by a bomb, planted by Croatian nationalist terrorists who were opposed to the Yugoslav government. They had smuggled the device onto the plane, hidden in the luggage, timed to detonate during the flight. Their goal was to make a political statement, to draw attention to their cause by committing an act of terror. They succeeded in destroying the plane, but the world would remember this flight for a completely different reason. When the bomb exploded, the DC-9 broke into multiple sections. The cockpit separated and fell away. The wings broke off. The fuselage split into pieces. And all 28 people on board were suddenly falling through the sky, some still strapped into seats, some thrown free, all plummeting toward Earth from over 6 miles up. The fall from 33,000 feet takes roughly 3.5 to 4 minutes if you account for air resistance reaching terminal velocity, which for a human body is about 120 miles per hour. That's 4 minutes of conscious falling, for minutes of knowing you're about to die, for minutes of absolute terror. Most of the passengers and crew died on impact when their sections of the plane hit the ground at full speed. The forces involved are unimaginable. The human body simply cannot survive that kind of collision. But one section of the plane, the tail section, fell differently. And inside that tail section, trapped in the rear galley area, was Vesna Vulović. She had been in the back of the plane when the explosion occurred, possibly preparing a meal cart or organizing supplies. The blast threw her into the galley area, and somehow, by some miracle of physics and circumstance, she remained with that section as it fell. The tail section, because of its shape and weight distribution, didn't fall straight down like a rock. It tumbled and spun through the air, slowing its descent somewhat. It also fell into a heavily forested area, covered with deep snow. When it finally hit the ground, it crashed into a steep, snow-covered mountain slope among thick pine trees. The trees broke the fall, the snow cushioned the impact, and the tail section, though destroyed, absorbed much of the force. And somehow, impossibly, Vesna survived. Vesna doesn't remember the fall. She doesn't remember the explosion, the moment of impact, or anything about those 4 minutes in the sky. The trauma was so severe that her brain blocked it all out, a mercy really, because who would want to remember falling from 33,000 feet? Her last memory before the crash was boarding the plane in Copenhagen and starting her shift. Her next memory was waking up in a hospital much later, with no idea what had happened or how she got there. But between those two memories, something extraordinary occurred. When the tail section hit the ground in the forest near the village of Srpska Kamenis in Czechoslovakia, not far from the East German border, it made an enormous noise. Local villagers heard the crash and saw smoke rising from the forest. A man named Bruno Honke, a World War II veteran who had medical training, was one of the first to reach the crash site. He climbed through the snow and wreckage expecting to find only bodies, but as he searched through the twisted metal of the tail section, he heard something impossible. He heard screaming. Vesna was alive, trapped in the wreckage, barely conscious, screaming in agony, but alive. Bruno couldn't believe it. He later said he thought he was hallucinating at first because surviving such a fall seemed medically impossible. Bruno immediately went to work trying to keep Vesna alive until help could arrive. She was in catastrophic condition. Her injuries were horrific. She had a fractured skull, her legs were broken in multiple places, 3 vertebrae in her spine were crushed, several ribs were broken, and she was bleeding internally. She was going in and out of consciousness, in shock, hypothermic from the freezing temperatures. Bruno used his medical training to stabilize her as best he could, talking to her, keeping her warm with his coat, trying to stop the bleeding. Other villagers arrived and helped, and eventually, emergency services made it to the remote crash site. Vesna was carefully extracted from the wreckage and rushed to the hospital in the nearby town of Srpska Kamenis. The doctors who received her were stunned that she was alive. Based on her injuries and the circumstances, she should have been dead 100 times over. They immediately took her into surgery, working for hours to repair the damage, to stop internal bleeding, to stabilize her broken bones, to relieve pressure on her brain from the skull fracture. She was put into a medically induced coma to give her body a chance to heal. For 27 days, Vesna remained in a coma, hovering between life and death, while doctors did everything they could to save her. Meanwhile, the investigation into the crash was underway. Authorities quickly determined that an explosion had caused the disaster. They found evidence of a bomb in the wreckage, and Croatian nationalist groups eventually claimed responsibility. The attack was politically motivated, part of a campaign against the Yugoslav government. 6 Croatians were eventually arrested and convicted for the bombing, though the main organizer escaped and lived in exile. But while the political story played out in the news, the real story that captured the world's attention was Vesna's survival. Word spread that a young woman had survived a fall from 33,000 feet, and journalists from around the world descended on the hospital in Czechoslovakia. How was it possible? What were the odds? Scientists, doctors, and aviation experts were all baffled. After 27 days, Vesna woke up. She was confused, in terrible pain, unable to move most of her body, but she was conscious and she was alive. The doctors told her what had happened, that her plane had exploded, that she had fallen from the sky, that everyone else had died. She didn't believe them at first. How could that be possible? How could she have fallen 6 miles and lived? But as the days went by and she saw the news coverage, read the articles, heard from investigators, the impossible truth sank in. She was the sole survivor of a terrorist attack, the only person out of 28 to live through the destruction of Flight 367. The fact that she had no memory of the fall was both a blessing and deeply strange. Most of 1972 was a blank to her. The trauma had wiped out not just the crash, but months of memories before and after. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. Her recovery was long and agonizing. She spent months in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries, learning to move again, fighting infections, dealing with constant pain. The injuries to her spine were particularly severe, and doctors weren't sure if she would ever walk again. Her legs had been shattered, her pelvis fractured, her back broken. But Vesna was determined. With intense physical therapy, with sheer willpower, she slowly regained function. First she could sit up. Then she could stand with support. Then she took her first steps, painful, shaky, but steps nonetheless. It took over a year, but eventually she was able to walk again, though she would have a permanent limp and would need a cane for the rest of her life. The psychological recovery was harder to measure. She had survived the unsurvivable, but 27 people had died, including her colleagues, her friends, and the crew. She struggled with survivor's guilt, with nightmares even though she couldn't remember the fall, with fear of flying. But she also became a symbol of hope, of incredible resilience of the human spirit. So how did Vesna survive? This is the question that has fascinated scientists, doctors, and aviation experts for over 50 years. Falling from 33,000 feet should be absolutely fatal. The impact forces are so extreme that the human body is essentially liquefied. So what factors came together to allow Vesna to live? Let's break down the science and the luck involved. First, she was in the tail section of the aircraft when it broke apart. This is crucial. The tail section is at the back of the plane, and when the fuselage split, she was inside a structure rather than being thrown out into the open air. If she had been ejected from the plane like many other passengers, she would have fallen as a free body and died on impact without question. Being inside the tail section gave her protection, a shell around her that would absorb some of the impact forces. Second, the tail section didn't fall straight down. Because of its shape, weight, and the way it was tumbling through the air, it fell slower than a human body in free fall would. Terminal velocity for a human is about 120 miles per hour. The tail section, because it was larger and created more air resistance, likely fell at a somewhat slower speed, maybe 80 to 100 miles per hour. Still incredibly fast, still absolutely deadly under normal circumstances, but every bit of reduced speed matters when we're talking about impact forces. Third, the location of the impact was perfect as you could hope for in a disaster. The tail section came down in a heavily forested mountain area. The trees, thick pine trees, acted like a series of cushions. When the tail section hit the tree canopy, the branches broke and bent, slowing the descent over a fraction of a second. Each broken branch absorbed a tiny bit of energy. Then the wreckage continued down through more branches, breaking more, slowing more. By the time the tail section hit the actual ground, much of the kinetic energy had been dissipated by the trees. On top of that, the ground itself was covered in deep snow because it was January in Czechoslovakia. Snow is an excellent shock absorber. When the tail section finally made contact with the earth, it hit a snow-covered slope at an angle rather than flat ground at 90 degrees. The slope meant that some of the force was redirected horizontally, rather than all being absorbed vertically. The snow compressed and cushioned the impact, and the tail section crumpled and deformed, absorbing energy in its destruction, like how a car's crumple zone protects passengers in a crash. All of these factors together, being in the tail, the slower fall, the trees, the snow, the slope, the wreckage absorbing energy, combined to reduce the impact forces just enough that Vesna's body, though catastrophically injured, remained intact enough for her to survive. Fourth, Vesna's position inside the tail section mattered. According to some accounts, she was wedged into a tight space in the galley area, possibly pinned between a food cart and a wall. This meant her body was braced and couldn't be thrown around inside the wreckage during the tumbling fall and the impact. If she had been loose, bouncing around inside the tail section as it fell, she likely would have been killed by impacts with interior before ever reaching the ground. Being wedged, though terrifying and painful, likely saved her life by keeping her relatively stationary. Fifth, and this is where we get into more speculative territory, Vesna had low blood pressure. She later mentioned in interviews that she suffered from chronic low blood pressure, a condition called hypotension. Some medical experts have theorized that this might have helped her survive the fall, because low blood pressure means the heart doesn't have to work as hard and the blood vessels are less likely to rupture under extreme stress. When the impact occurred, her cardiovascular system might have been slightly more resilient because it was operating at lower pressure. This is speculative and not proven, but it's an interesting theory. Sixth, pure luck in terms of how her body was positioned at the moment of impact. If her head had hit first, she would have died instantly from a broken neck or catastrophic brain injury. If her spine had compressed in a slightly different way, she could have been paralyzed or killed. The specific angles and forces that her body experienced were, by pure chance, just barely survivable. A few degrees different, a slightly harder impact, a different orientation, and she would have died like everyone else. Now, despite all these factors, Vesna's survival is still considered medically miraculous. Doctors who reviewed her case said that even with all the lucky circumstances, the odds of surviving such a fall are essentially zero. She should have died from the impact forces, from internal bleeding, from shock, from hypothermia in the snow, from any number of complications. The fact that she lived long enough to be found, that Bruno Honky got to her in time, that the hospitals were able to stabilize her, that her body healed enough for her to recover, all of it was a chain of improbable events. Guinness World Records officially recognize her survival as the highest fall without a parachute ever survived, a record that still stands today and likely will forever because nobody should ever be in a position to break it. So what happened to Vesna after she recovered from the crash? How do you live a normal life after experiencing something so extraordinary and traumatic? For a while, Vesna struggled. She had to relearn how to walk, how to do basic tasks, how to live with chronic pain and disabilities from her injuries. She was left with a permanent limp, recurring headaches, and back problems that would plague her for the rest of her life. She also dealt with the psychological weight of being a sole survivor. Why did she live when everyone else died? Why was she the one pinned in the right spot in the tail section while others weren't? These questions haunted her. But Vesna was remarkably resilient. By 1973, just over a year after the crash, she had recovered enough to return to work. And now here's what's astonishing. She went back to working as a flight attendant. Yes, the woman who fell from the sky got back on planes. When asked about this decision, she said she wasn't afraid of flying because she couldn't remember the crash. To her, getting back on a plane was just going back to work, returning to normalcy, not giving in to fear. JAT Yugoslav Airlines gave her a desk job at first, but she insisted on flying again. They eventually allowed her to return to flight duty, though she worked mainly on domestic flights within Yugoslavia rather than international routes. She continued working for the airline until her retirement in the early 1990s. Vesna also became somewhat of a celebrity. Her story was so incredible that media from around the world wanted to interview her. She appeared on television shows, gave talks, met with other survivors of disasters and accidents. She was invited to events celebrating human resilience and survival. For a time, she enjoyed the attention, the recognition of what she had been through. But she also grew tired of being known only for the crash. She was a person with interests, hobbies, and a life beyond that one terrible day. In interviews later in life, she expressed mixed feelings about the fame. She was grateful to be alive and understood that her story inspired people, but she also wanted to be seen as more than just the woman who fell from the sky. Politically, Vesna was outspoken. She opposed the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s and was critical of NATO's bombing of Serbia in 1999. She participated in protests and was vocal about her beliefs, which made her a controversial figure in some circles. But those who knew her said she was principled and passionate about her country and her people. She never married and had no children. She lived most of her adult life in Belgrade, in the same small apartment for decades. Friends described her as modest, kind, a bit stubborn, and fiercely independent despite her physical limitations. She loved animals, particularly cats, and cared for several strays over the years. She enjoyed reading, watching movies, and spending time with close friends. In many ways, she lived a quiet, ordinary life, which is perhaps what she wanted after such an extraordinary ordeal. As she aged, Vesna's health declined. The injuries from the crash, particularly to her spine and legs, caused increasing problems. She spent more time at home, less able to move around easily. In December 2016, at the age of 66, Vesna Vulović died in her apartment in Belgrade from natural causes, likely a heart attack or stroke. She was found by friends who hadn't heard from her in a while. The news of her death spread around the world. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers in dozens of countries. People who had never met her but knew her story mourned her passing. Aviation enthusiasts, survivors of other disasters, ordinary people who had been inspired by her resilience, all paid tribute. The Serbian government honored her with a state funeral. Thousands attended to pay their respects. She was buried in Belgrade, and her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who admired her strength and spirit. In the end, Vesna Vulović lived 44 years after the crash. She survived the unsurvivable, recovered from injuries that should have left her paralyzed or dead, returned to the job that nearly killed her, and lived life on her own terms. She never let that one terrible day define her entire existence, even though the world wanted to see her as nothing but a miracle. She was complex, flawed, human, stubborn, brave, and utterly unforgettable. Vesna Vulovic's story has endured for over 50 years because it touches something deep in the human psyche. We are fascinated by impossible survival, by the idea that death can be cheated, that luck and circumstance can overcome physics and fate. Her story has been told and retold in books, documentaries, articles, and now here on YouTube. But there are aspects of the story that remain debated and questioned. Some conspiracy theorists have claimed over the years that the official story isn't true, that Vesna didn't actually fall from 33,000 feet, that maybe the plane was at a lower altitude when it exploded, or that her survival was exaggerated for propaganda purposes by the Yugoslav government. These theories have been thoroughly debunked. The crash was investigated by multiple countries, wreckage was analyzed, eyewitness accounts were collected, and the altitude of 33,000 feet is well documented in air traffic control records. Vesna herself maintained until her death that she had no reason to doubt the official account, even though she couldn't personally remember it. Guinness World Records verified the facts before awarding her the record, and no credible evidence has ever emerged to contradict the established story. Another question that people often ask is whether anyone else has survived a similar fall. The answer is complicated. There have been other cases of people surviving falls from aircraft, but almost all involved parachutes that partially deployed or falls from much lower altitudes or circumstances that were different from Vesna's. During World War II, there were several cases of airmen surviving falls from damaged bombers, usually because they fell into snow, water, or trees, and usually from lower altitudes. Nicholas Alcemade, a British tail gunner, fell 18,000 feet in 1944 when his bomber was shot down and survived by landing in snow and pine trees. Alan McGee, an American airman, fell 22,000 feet in 1943 and crashed through the glass roof of a train station in France, which broke his fall enough to survive. But Vesna's fall from 33,330 feet remains the highest ever survived without a parachute, and no one has come close to breaking that record, thank goodness. What can we learn from Vesna's story? On a practical level, not much. Her survival was such a unique combination of factors that it doesn't really teach us how to survive plane crashes. If anything, it confirms that falling from a plane is almost always fatal, and you should never, ever find yourself in that situation. But on a deeper level, Vesna's story is about resilience, about the strength of the human body and spirit, about not giving up even when everything seems hopeless. She didn't choose to fall from the sky, but she chose to recover, to walk again, to fly again, to live fully despite her trauma. That's the real miracle, not just surviving the fall, but surviving the aftermath with grace and determination. So there you have it, the complete story of Vesna Vulović, the woman who fell from the sky and lived to tell the tale, even though she couldn't remember it herself. A young flight attendant on a routine flight, caught in a terrorist attack, thrown from her exploding plane at 33,000 feet, falling for miles through freezing air, crashing into a snow-covered forest, found alive by a local hero, spending months recovering from catastrophic injuries, returning to flying despite everything, living a long life on her own terms, and finally passing away peacefully in 2016. Her story is a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, miracles happen. that the impossible is sometimes just barely possible, that luck and circumstance can align in ways we can't predict or control, that the human body, for all its fragility, is also incredibly tough, and that the human spirit is even tougher. Vesna didn't ask to be famous. She didn't ask to hold a world record. She just wanted to do her job and live her life. But fate had other plans, and she handled what happened to her with remarkable strength. The next time you're on a plane, look out the window at the ground far below. Think about what it would mean to fall from that height. Then remember Vesna Vulović and feel grateful that such things are extraordinarily rare and in awe that one person survived it. Rest in peace, Vesna. Your story will never be forgotten. Thanks for watching.